I've come to the Orkney Islands to make history. Eminent geneticist Sir Walter Bodmer is examining DNA drawn from different parts of the country to shed some light on Dark Age Britain. His team have been in Orkney, hoping to answer a key question about the Viking invasion. Did the Viking warriors who came in their longboats come in large numbers? And did they bring their women with them? Or did the Vikings steal the wives and daughters of the local Pictish Celtic farmers? And were the Pictish men then slaughtered? Amazingly, the DNA of today's Orcadians holds the answer. If the Vikings settled down alongside the Picts, we would expect the Viking genetic imprint to be very much in the minority in today's population, especially since the Orkneys have been part of Scotland since the 15th century. And if the Vikings brought women, then any Viking signal should be roughly equal in both men and women living in the islands today. The results of the study are finally through. Sir Walter and his team have been examining the Y chromosome in the men on the islands. This chromosome is passed down the male line. Men in Norway and Sweden carry a distinctive Y chromosome inherited from their distant Viking predecessors. The key marker gene is known to geneticists as M17. By examining the frequency of this gene among the men in Orkney, Sir Walter can tell how many of them are descended from Viking males. Likewise, by looking for markers in the island women, Sir Walter can tell how many of them were descended from Viking women. After weeks of analysis, Sir Walter is ready at last to announce the results.
What we find there is if we just look at the Y chromosome, that mix is something like 55%. The male component comes from the Vikings.
Even after centuries of interaction with the Celtic mainland, more than half of Orkney's males can be directly linked to Norse Vikings. Together with the archaeological evidence, this strongly suggests that the Vikings overwhelmed the Pictish men when they invaded these islands, either slaughtering most of them or driving most of them out. But what about the women? Their results are enormously revealing. Only 1 in 10 Orcadian women is descended from a Viking woman. The female ancestors of the women on these islands were Pictish. Viking women must have been brought to Orkney over the years, but only in small numbers.
And that fits in with the notion that the initial invasions must have been by armies, and the armies were men. And many of the men will eventually have settled and taken on local wives.
The genes of today's Orcadians have a terrible, violent story to tell. The murdering and raping carried out by their male Viking ancestors is written into the DNA of today's population. The Norsemen ravaged these islands, driving out or slaughtering the Pictish men and taking their daughters and wives by force. But what about the individuals involved in the study? How will their stories conform to this general picture? Jean Flett has an ancient Viking surname, passed down the male side of the family. But what will her DNA reveal?
Hello?
Hello, is that Jean?
Yes, this is me.
Hello, Jean, it's Neil.
I've got Sir Walter with me.
Thank you.
Hello, Jean. We've got your results here from your sample of DNA.
For all her Viking name, Jean's genetic ancestry is overwhelmingly Celtic. The signal is 13 times more strongly Celtic than Norse. She may have had some distant male Viking ancestor, but there's little doubt he took for himself a Pictish woman.
It doesn't have anything to say that that is inconsistent with the fact that your ancestry goes back all that way in Orkney.
No. But my own theory is that the Vikings settled in and married in among the population.
Jack Rendell was born on the island of Hoy and also has an ancient Viking name. Jack's DNA results do indeed show that he has the M17 Norse marker, which means he can trace his male lineage all the way back to the Vikings who settled Orkney. But as his more recent family history suggests, there's also a strong Celtic component. The results for Evelyn Glennie, however, are surprising.
The results of your genetic test show that the people that you're descended from were Viking stock.
Although we know that Evelyn has some Pict genes in the mix, the Viking signal is very dominant in her genetic profile, which means by far the greater number of her ancestors were of Nordic origin.
Well, it's just been fascinating to find all of this out, you know, really fantastic.
The Genetics Project has opened a remarkable window on Orkney's turbulent history. The islands still bear a strong Viking hallmark, but they also reveal a lingering Celtic legacy, inherited in part from Pictish women who were among the original inhabitants of these islands. But when it comes to people who have invaded Britain, there is one lot who stand head and shoulders above the rest in our historical memory. For many of us, William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings in 1066 marks the beginning of British history proper. So, like William, I'm off to the southern coast of England in search of some of his Norman descendants.
The Norman conquest of 1066 was the last successful invasion of Britain. So I'm curious to find out how big a stamp the Norman invaders left on Anglo-Saxon England. So I'm heading down to the south coast to meet people who've taken part in the genetics study and to investigate the influence of the Norman invaders who settled there.
The southeast is, historically, about the busiest region of Britain. So it'll be interesting to see what lies hidden in the DNA of the volunteers from Kent and Sussex.
I think when you've researched the family, you feel closer to them, and you feel like you wish you had known them. But what were they doing 1,000 years ago?
On my father's side, they're farming and building, and then in the 1500s brewing. But I was born in Hastings, and therefore 1066 has perhaps even a bit more poignance to it. And I'd love to know whether I was Norman or Saxon.
My grandparents and my great-grandparents, I know they've been farmers, but apparently word has it that we were woodmen up in Scotland.
As a boy, I've heard my grandfather tell stories of the family, and it's another part of where we've come from. Been in East Kent since certainly the 17th century. Family tradition is that we are actually Flemish refugees.
While the Oxford team analysed the DNA samples, I'm off to do some digging around of my own. When the Normans arrived, Anglo-Saxon England was already well populated, and we know that the Normans didn't slaughter the Saxons. So, how many Normans came over, and what form did the conquest take? At the Norman castle in Lewis, I meet up with Professor David Carpenter.
You've got to think of a small group of elite conquerors. It's like a sort of corporate smash and grab raid in which a very small number of Normans seize all the wealth of England. They've expelled the Anglo-Saxon landowners. They'd come to stay and think, how do we stay? We've got to physically get hold of the country, and they do that through their castles.
So is it all about inflicting their own culture on the place?
No, and if it had been, the Normans would never have stayed. They would never have survived. It was much more subtle than that. It's not like Iraq. Remember, the British and the Americans take over Iraq, the whole superstructure collapses. It's just anarchy. There was nothing like that in England because William the Conqueror was far too clever for that. He kept a large part of the English administrative structure, and so he was able to suck the wealth of England and take a lot of it back to Normandy. But also in a more subtle way too, the Normans in a way then integrated into England. They almost become English.
But you don't have to find a Norman castle to explore the cultural impact of 1066, as I discovered over a working lunch with linguist Elaine Treharne.
How much does this plateful owe to France and the Normans?
Well, just the word plate, for a start, is Norman in origin. And looking at what we've got here, we've got this pastry, pasty type thing, both of which are French words. There are over 10,000 French words in English, at least 75% still in use from the medieval period.
Given that the Normans were such a minority, why didn't they acquire more English?
those who are in power or in control tend to have the greatest influence.